Good evening, and welcome to 3GNY Stories Live WEDU Wednesdays. I'm Gail Steinweiss-Peck, a 3GNY founding and current board member and grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors. I'm thrilled to be here for our first ever WEDU Wednesday featuring 3GNY's founder, Daniel Brooks. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit organization for grandchildren of survivors and their supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and the lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. Founded in 2005 with a group of 6, 3GNY's membership now exceeds 2,400. Before COVID-19, we've held diverse in-person programs, including museum tours, film screenings, theater engagements, discussion groups, book talks, volunteering with survivors, Shabbat dinners, Jewish cultural events, intergenerational gatherings, genealogy workshops, and more. We've recently pivoted to virtual events and are proud to share our work with those of you who ordinarily wouldn't be available to attend our programs, along with our valued community members. 3GNY has helped launch 3G groups in other areas of the country. These include 3GDC and 3GNJ. Our leadership collaborates with other 3Gs around the country and even around the world to share our experience and insights with them and help them get their groups off the ground. 3GNY is most proud of its flagship educational program, WEDU, which stands for We Educate. This initiative empowers grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their families' Holocaust experiences in school classrooms and community groups. I'd now like to introduce Leora Klein, 3GNY founding and current board member and educational leader, who will share more about WEDU.
Sorry. Thank you, Gail, and good evening, everyone. My name is Leora Klein, and I'm the grandchildren of 4 Holocaust survivors. I'm excited to be here tonight to tell you about WEDU, which, as Gail said, stands for We Educate. Developed under the guidance of Facing History and ourselves, WEDU prepares descendants of survivors to learn and share their family stories in classrooms. WEDU is a powerful contribution to Holocaust education. As the population of survivors declines, their stories must not be lost with them. We, as the grandchildren of survivors, are taking responsibility for our legacy. As a living link to our grandparents' stories, we are in a unique position to highlight the individual experience from the collective. WEDU makes connections between historical events and issues of modern-day intolerance. By spotlighting the individual narrative, we create a personal connection to history as we demonstrate the dangerous consequences of silence. In a multicultural society, we all have a stake in challenging assumptions. WEDU actively engages students to think about ways to confront intolerance and prejudice. Sharing authentic stories allows us to connect with people from different backgrounds and levels of understanding. This fosters dialogue and inspires students to explore their own family history as an entry point to understand world history. We are proud to share that for WEDU, we have entered into a collaborative partnership with the American Society for Yad Vashem's Young Leadership Associates. Since we started in 2010, we have trained 250 speakers, visited 300 classrooms in 100 different schools. We have reached more than 20,000 students, and we're still going. Since COVID-19, we have moved our WEDU training sessions onto a virtual platform. We now visit classrooms via Zoom, and we work with teachers to ensure that we could still make the same impact even if we cannot be there in person. And yet, we are very aware that we have so much more to do. In order for us to keep going and keep doing our critical work, your support is essential. 3GNY is a volunteer-run organization, and we rely on donations to keep WEDU and our comprehensive educational programs running. $300 can sponsor a gift can sponsor a 3G to go through the WEDU program. $3,600 can sponsor an entire WEDU class of 10 participants, 10 grandchildren of survivors. There is a link to our donation page in the chat box, and we hope you will make a gift today. Thank you for helping us honor the memories of our grandparents and ensuring that never forget is not just words. In just a moment, you will have a chance to see WEDU in action through 3GNY's founder, Dan Brooks, who will share his grandmother's story. Dan Brooks, my old friend, is a grandson of 4 Holocaust survivors. He grew up feeling a strong connection to his family's history and wanted to explore what this connection meant. In 2005, he started 3GNY. He was director of the organization for a decade, leading its growth and community impact. Dan was born and raised in Queens, New York. He has a bachelor's degree in communications from Boston University and is currently a human resources manager at a law firm in Manhattan. In addition to his 3G activism, Dan is an experienced Israel advocate. He has organized demonstrations, spoken on panels, written in numerous pro-Israel organizations, and a frequent op-ed contributor to the Times of Israel. It is my personal privilege to introduce Dan, whom I met at the first 3G meeting he held in New York City back in 2005. I was immediately wowed by the depth of his historical understanding and the urgency of his need to act. Before I met Dan, I was grappling with the legacy of being a grandchild of survivors. After I met Dan, I had a partner and a leader in this critical and difficult work of active commemoration. It is truly my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dan Brooks.
Thank you so much, Leora, and thank you, Gail. Thank you also to the entire 3G board for all of your hard work and commitment. And thank you also to everybody joining us this evening. So in 2005, as Leora mentioned, I was living here in New York. I was in my late 20s, and I found myself on an email list run by survivors and their children, who were mostly posting information about survivors speaking around the country. And every so often, I saw an announcement for 2G meetings. These were discussion groups for children of survivors. This was also the first time that I saw the term 2G. I noticed a meeting of 2Gs taking place in New York at a synagogue on Manhattan's East Side. I was curious, and so I showed up. And I sat in a group of about 30 people, my parents' age, sitting in a circle. They shared their family stories and what it was like growing up as children of survivors, and spoke of some of the psychological trauma passed on to them. Although I appreciated hearing their stories, this didn't feel like the right forum to me to share my perspective as a grandchild of survivors. Interestingly though, at this meeting, I noticed 4 other people my age, and we all kept quiet. And none of us were called upon to speak, which was fine for me because this really wasn't a forum for us. Still, I saw 3G showing up, and I felt there was a need for our generation. So right away, I perused the program guides of Jewish institutions in New York, and I looked around elsewhere. But I soon discovered that there were no programs specifically for the 3rd generation. I felt this was a major void in the Jewish community, so I sent out an email to every young Jewish person I knew, calling for the grandchildren of survivors to come together. And this was in 2005, so it was just before Facebook. So instead of just liking a post, people actually back then had to articulate their interest in something. And we got some nice interest right away. At the time, the 92nd Street Y had an institution geared for young professionals called McCourt. It was a brownstone on the Upper West Side, and I asked the director there if we could use the lobby for this meeting. A few weeks after sending my email, 5 grandchildren of survivors showed up. The agenda was simple. It was to share our family stories and to discuss our legacy. Sounds so simple, right? It was this group of 6 that formed the first board of what was to become 3GNY. What? Yep. Just give me 1 second. Lost my place. So it was this group of 6 that was the first board of 3GNY. And the 6 of us didn't know each other, and we worked in different fields, but we all felt an immediate bond. And none of us had ever really discussed our family stories with strangers. Our grandparents' stories are not something that would typically come up, so we all expressed a relief in being able to speak about something so important to us, 2 people who understood. Apart from this personal catharsis, we all understood the collective importance of what we were doing. That as the population of survivors declines, their stories should not be lost with them. That our generation is primarily the last living link to survivors, and it's through us that future generations will hear the actual stories of our grandparents' survival and the losses of that generation. That sharing our story is important not just for communicating to the public a big part of the Jewish story, but important in conveying universal messages of tolerance and of having social awareness. Amazingly, it was at this first meeting that we came to a quick consensus on our mission: to provide a forum for the descendants of survivors and to use that forum to preserve and pass on our family histories. At the following month's meeting, we had 12 in attendance. At the next one, we had 20. So we soon moved out of the lobby, and throughout that first year, we put on events where newcomers could share their family stories for the first time. And we also created social events where we could start to build a community. In 2006, we established 3GNY as an educational nonprofit organization. And this forum that we established where we could finally articulate our family stories led to our establishing in 2009 our education initiative called WEDU, which Leora just spoke about. While we in that first group of WEDU educators went through a formal training, we had also benefited from years of hearing other 3Gs share their stories, which had been a sort of indirect training for us. While it had been new experience for me to share my family story with strangers who were fellow 3Gs, it was a profoundly different experience to share my family story with public school students who were not only not 3Gs, but who were predominantly not Jewish and who knew very little about Jews and the Holocaust. This has really been the most meaningful and humbling experience of my life. I've been so honored to have such a platform, and I'm especially honored after so many years to share with you, a group of my peers, what I've shared in the classrooms. And this is my classroom presentation. I grew up in New York City in a neighborhood in Queens called Bayside. I grew up knowing I was the grandson of 4 Holocaust survivors before I understood what that meant. I'm going to share with you the story of my grandmother, my mother's mother. My mother grew up in Milwaukee, and that's where my grandparents remained when I was growing up. As a kid, when we visited my grandparents there, I felt their warmth and love and their humor. At the same time, I felt there was something deeper, a complex history that I was too young to understand. My grandparents spoke excellent English, but they also spoke with an accent, and they spoke Yiddish to each other and to my mother. Yiddish was for centuries the language of European Jews. I knew my grandparents were immigrants, but I didn't know where they came from and why. And I wasn't even aware that they had any other relatives. It's just something I had never thought about. I didn't start to grasp any of this until I was 12, when I was preparing for my bar mitzvah. A bar mitzvah is a Jewish coming of age ceremony for 13-year-olds. It celebrates our becoming adults, according to Jewish tradition. For girls, it's called a bat mitzvah. So one night, I complained to my mother that I wasn't gonna have as many guests at my bar mitzvah party as some of my friends had at theirs. And my mother responded that at her own brother's, my uncle's bar mitzvah years earlier, he also had only a very small party with just his close friends. She said this was because he didn't have his own grandparents, or uncles, or aunts, or cousins in his life. They had all perished in the Holocaust before he was born, because they were Jews. My grandparents were the only ones of their large families to survive. Hearing this gave me some needed perspective. I right away became interested in learning about my grandparents' story and about the larger history of the Holocaust. At that moment, my mother handed me my grandmother's memoirs. In 1985, my grandmother sat down with my mother and uncle over several days and dictated her story. This book of unpublished memoirs became a family heirloom. A whole world was opened up for me. I read about my grandma Rachel, about her parents, my great-grandparents, about her growing up in Poland, about her 7 brothers and sisters, about how she met my grandfather Henry and his life and family, and how they survived together and apart during the war. My grandma passed away in 2007 at the age of 89. I was so fortunate that as an adult, I had the chance to spend more time with her and get to know her more. She was truly a remarkable person, and this is her story. My grandma came from a small city called Brest-Litovsk in what is today the country of Belarus in Eastern Europe. At the time, before World War II, it was within the borders of Poland. About half of the city's population was Jewish. And there was intermingling in the markets and streets of the city between the Jewish and Christian populations. But in this city and throughout the countries of Eastern Europe, Jews were mostly a separate community. Jews had their own culture, their own language and customs and education. Jews were also discriminated against by the majority non-Jewish population and mostly banned from being in the government and in universities and kept out of professions in journalism, law, and medicine. My grandma was one of 8 children. She was the middle child. They didn't have a lot of money, and my family lived modestly, but they had a very happy home. And they had a very busy home, which included grandparents. Grandma would say that when any of the kids were late to the dinner table, they missed out on dinner. There wasn't a scrap of food left. This is a picture of my grandmother as a teenager. My grandma is on the right, and she's with a close friend of hers growing up. My grandma was particularly close with her older sister, Fela, you see here. Fela and her other sisters taught my grandma to sew, which would come in handy years later when, in 1937, my grandma was 20, she moved with Fela to the capital city of Warsaw, which was about 3 hours away by train. This is a picture of my grandmother at 20. Together, my grandma and Fela opened up a women's clothing store. And this was very rare for the time, not just for 2 women who weren't well-to-do, but for 2 Jewish women who weren't well-to-do. This business became very successful and soon expanded to other cities in Poland. Meanwhile, in the neighboring country of Germany, the Nazis had been in power for 4 years. Since they'd come to power, they had passed laws against German Jews. The Nazis had become increasingly vocal about how the Jews in Germany and throughout the world were inferior to white Aryan people and dangerous to the new racial order they were trying to create. Even though many Jews, including my grandma, were growing fearful of the Nazis were still just in Germany. It's important to note that Jews in Germany at this time were less than 1% of the general German population. There were about 500,000 Jews in Germany, which was a country of about 60 million. By comparison, the United States today has 300 million people. In all of Europe during the 1930s, there were about 9 million Jews. And Poland, where my grandma grew up, had the largest percentage. There were 3 million Jews in Poland, which were about 10% of the total Polish population. So now it's 1939, and Germany invades Poland. This heightened the fears of my grandma and her family, and the fears of many Jews throughout Europe. Germany didn't stop at Poland, as you see from the map. They took over other countries throughout Europe. And in those countries, they instituted the anti-Jewish laws they had set up in Germany years earlier. Also during this year, Germany made a pact with Russia to split Poland between themselves. So the western half of Poland, which included Warsaw, fell under the Nazis, and the eastern half fell under the Russians. So everything to the right, or the east of the red line, was in the Russian zone, and that's where Brest-Litovsk was. And while the Russian government, at the time called the Soviet Union, discriminated against Jews, it wasn't as harsh or violent as the Nazis. And so many Jews made the decision to flee east, away from the Nazis. And my grandma was one of them. However, her sister Fela, with her husband and baby, decided to stay in Warsaw and to take their chances with the Nazis in power. So my grandma made her way back to Brest-Litovsk to be with her family. And once there, she met her future husband, my grandfather, Henry. This is him in his early 20s. They married less than a year later in 1940. Henry was a chemical engineer by training, so he was deemed valuable enough to the authorities to be sent to a slave labor camp. While my grandma's family in her hometown was safe for the time being, my grandma was very worried about her sister Fela back in Warsaw, where the Nazis at this time had forced all the Jews into a ghetto. The Nazis, when they invaded a new country, forced Jews out of their homes by gunpoint and forced them to move into the poorest sections of the city, which they walled off and stationed soldiers outside. This was meant to separate and isolate the Jews. Meanwhile, the non-Jews in these areas were able to move into the Jews' former homes outside what was to become the ghetto. And these ghettos were meant by the Nazis to be temporary, a place from where Jews would either be shipped to death camps or used as slave labor in ghetto factories until they died. This is why ghettos were set up only in cities with trains running through them, so they can more easily ship Jews to death camps. Warsaw was the biggest city where a ghetto was set up. Throughout the Warsaw Ghetto, there were multiple families living in one apartment. Water and sanitation had been cut off by the Nazis, and food was very scarce. At one point, 5,000 Jews a month were dying of starvation in the streets of the ghetto. And the only way to get any food was to be lucky enough to work as a slave laborer in one of the factories the Nazis set up. If you were too old or too young, you were in trouble. My grandma's sister Fela couldn't work. Fela's husband worked all day in the factory, and she had a newborn baby to take care of. So my grandma made a brave decision to go back to Warsaw, into Nazi-occupied territory, and into the ghetto to be with her sister. Jews didn't normally volunteer to go into the ghettos, but on occasion when they did, it was to rejoin family that they had been separated from. And while conditions in the ghetto were horrific, nobody could have imagined that the Nazis were going to ship Jews to death camps. The Nazis soon started these deportations from the ghettos. They posted announcements throughout the ghetto demanding that Jews living in certain areas of the ghetto had to report the next morning at the train station. This is a picture of these men, women, and children at the Warsaw Ghetto train station, where they were told to bring money and very few belongings. And the Nazis, to ensure that there wouldn't be any resistance, told the Jews in these announcements that they were going to be shipped, or as they called it, resettled, to live in the East. My grandma and her sister Fela every day feared they were going to be next. My grandma was fortunate in that she managed to find work as a slave laborer at a factory in the ghetto. One day, my grandma was on her way back from the factory and was caught in a random roundup by the Nazis, who searched Jews for anything that they deemed illegal. So for instance, it was illegal for a Jew to have food on them. The penalty was immediate execution. Often, even if nothing was found on a Jewish person, the Nazis would shoot them anyway. On this occasion, everyone in this group that my grandmother was in was lined up, searched, and then shot. My grandma was the last one in this group, and she had just witnessed the boy next to her, a boy of about 17 years old, shot between the eyes at close range. My grandmother had smuggled a piece of dry bread in her jacket to bring back to her sister and baby nephew. At that moment, my grandma courageously looked directly into the Nazi officer's face. She smiled and she said, "You don't mind if I have a little bread, do you?" And he right away stepped back and he walked away. She was left there standing alone on the bloody cobblestones of that ghetto street with the bodies of murdered Jews all around her. The Nazis constantly showed their inhumanity. Every so often, Nazi officials or soldiers would bring their girlfriends or wives with them as they drove through the ghetto on their military jeeps, taunting Jews for their own amusement. One day, my grandma was walking on a main street in the ghetto behind a younger teenager, maybe 13 years old. A Nazi jeep pulled up alongside the boy, and a Nazi soldier pulled out his baton and walloped the boy in the back of his head, who fell to the ground with blood gushing out. The boy had been killed, but people didn't stop, and they couldn't stop. Jews could only remove the corpses lying in the street with the official permission of the Nazis. My grandma saw all this in front of her, and all she could do was walk by this dying boy as if it was ordinary. And this is how easily a life could be reduced to nothing. Soon after that, my grandma came home one night from the factory to an empty apartment. The families living there, including my grandma's sister and baby nephew, she found out were earlier that day forced onto the trains that took them to the death camp called Treblinka, where they were immediately gassed to death. At the time, my grandma didn't know about Treblinka or that her family would be killed there. So when I was a teenager in the 1990s and learning my grandma's story, all I could think about was how well connected our world was then in the 90s compared to my grandma's time. Telephones were around in the 30s and 40s, but few people had them. And it was mostly a time when people wrote letters. But during the war, this was restricted heavily. And many people during the war simply had no way of communicating with their loved ones living elsewhere. So learning her story, I kept thinking, how did she know what was happening to Henry? How did she know what was happening to her family back home? And she didn't know. And she would only find out years later, after the war was over, that when the Nazis had invaded Russia in 1941 and moved through her hometown of Brest-Litovsk, as they did with other towns, the Nazis forced by gunpoint all of the town's Jews out of their homes to a nearby forest where they were all shot into pits. After my grandmother's sister and baby nephew had been sent to the death camp, my grandma was all alone in the ghetto, and she knew that she needed to get out before she was next. While getting into the ghetto was easy, getting out was impossible. So what happened next was a miracle. The manager of the factory my grandma was at approached her and told her that Jews from the ghetto, even the factory workers, were being sent to their deaths. He said to my grandma, "You're too beautiful to die, so I'm going to help you." He gave her a forged Polish passport. He put her picture into it, and my grandma now took on the alias of Mariana Kowalski, a non-Jewish Polish name. She took off her Jewish armband that she had been forced to wear and found nice clothes to put on. The next day, he drove her out of the ghetto in his car, gave her a little money, and dropped her off at a regular Warsaw train station. He told her that she should take on the persona of his non-Jewish Polish secretary who was going to the countryside for a brief vacation. My grandma spoke Polish without a Jewish accent, and she didn't look particularly Jewish, at least according to how German and Polish people saw Jews. And so this was to be my grandma's method of survival until the end of the war. This was in 1942. And my grandma knew that she couldn't stay in one place for long, and so she decided to return to Warsaw after a few weeks with a renewed confidence that she could survive on her new identity. And it was a city that she knew well, so she thought she could take her chances there. Her goal now was, though, to reunite with Henry, whom she knew was sent to a nearby labor camp as part of a somewhat protected engineers group, which were being used by the Nazis for building projects, civic projects, which included both Jewish Poles and non-Jewish Poles. Through neighbors, my grandma found out where this camp was. And these neighbors were women whose husbands were imprisoned there. So she went along with these women one day when they went to the gates of the camp, which they weren't allowed to do. And they tried to glimpse their husbands and throw to them over the fence small packages of food and other valuables. My grandma had worked small jobs up to this point, and she cobbled together some money, which she used to get a second forged passport, this time for Henry. So my grandma packaged this fake passport along with some food and money, and she prayed that she'd see Henry from where she stood outside the camp gates. Miraculously, on her first visit to outside the labor camp, she soon spotted Henry, got his attention, and threw him the package over the fence. Word started getting out from the witnesses that the Jews were being sent not to be resettled, but to be killed. My grandparents both heard these rumors, and so Henry decided he had to escape now. One day when the guards were marching prisoners out to the woods for labor, he hung back in the group, and he kept hanging back, and when the guards were distracted, he darted out of sight, and he climbed up a tree nearby, and waited until the coast was clear. The guards sent dogs to search for him, but miraculously the dogs didn't detect him when they ran by the tree. So my grandpa now had his new passport and my grandma's address in Warsaw, and he soon found his way there and to her apartment. When he got to the door, my grandma later said he was a filthy bag of bones because he had been so starved to death, and he fell right into her arms. And thereafter, she protected and sheltered him. And it was dangerous for a man of military age to be outside on the streets at this time, so she was the one who could make the most of her non-Jewish identity. She kept working, but after a few weeks or months in one apartment, they had to move to another. And they moved around a lot during this time. Neighbors would eventually ask them probing questions. Once a neighbor screamed to her from down the hall, "You're a Jewess," and slammed the door. They had two different last names on their documents, so some of the neighbors who heard about this thought that they weren't married and just living in sin. And my grandparents kept getting invited to church services where they had to pretend as best they could to know the prayers. In April 1943, the Nazis organized the final deportations of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto. The Nazis were met with deadly resistance from the last remnant of Jews in the ghetto, who refused to surrender. The Jews in the ghetto had acquired small firearms and created Molotov cocktails and other bombs. My grandma and grandpa watched this ghetto uprising from the non-Jewish side of the ghetto walls, from their apartment. Every day they heard the crackle of gunfire and saw the plumes of smoke, and they couldn't believe that the powerful German army was suffering casualties from a group of mostly unarmed and starved Jewish inmates. This group of young Jews held off the German army for a full month before the Nazis burned down the ghetto block by block. 13,000 Jews were killed, most burnt alive, and the rest sent to death camps. With the Jewish population of Warsaw now virtually destroyed, my grandparents had to continue to blend in as non-Jews, which was getting increasingly difficult as the Nazis and their Polish informants would search everywhere in the city for Jews still hiding out. Towards the end of the war, in late 1944 and early 1945, they were nearly killed several times from bombs falling on the city from Allied and which included American warplanes targeting Nazi installations. My grandma later said that first she was bombed by the Germans, then the Russians, and then the Americans. In January 1945, Warsaw was liberated by Russian troops marching west towards Berlin. The city was in total ruin with bombed out buildings everywhere. My grandparents would soon discover that their entire families had been murdered. They made their way west to Munich, to the American occupied zone in Germany, where my grandpa was put in charge of a German chemical factory to get it up and running. But even after the war, it wasn't safe to be Jewish. Jewish survivors everywhere throughout Europe were still being killed with no punishments meted out to the perpetrators. My grandpa, it was only after the war that my grandpa started carrying a gun, and he couldn't even find a gun during the war, but here he had to because they received random verbal threats and intimidation after the war. My grandmother's first cousin, who had immigrated to America back in the 1920s, had found my grandmother's name on a survivor list and had arranged for a visa and ship tickets to America for my grandparents. After a 10-day trip across the Atlantic, they arrived in Brooklyn on March 3rd, 1947. My grandparents had 3 children. My mom was their first, born in January 1948. And my grandparents would have 4 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. When I've thought about my grandparents' lives, just from when they arrived in America, it's still an amazing story. They came to a new place. They had to learn a completely unfamiliar language and culture. You think they might carry with them sadness and anger, but they were always upbeat. And there were always people who embraced their life every day and their new lives in America. From the first decade they were here, they were heavily involved in philanthropy and in community service. They really wanted to participate fully in the American dream, not just for themselves and their children, but for others. And I'm proud to say that they did. Thank you everyone for listening to my story of my grandmother.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's amazing to see so many of those pictures and to hear your story again. I wanted to open the floor to questions. We have quite a few coming in. Some of them are directed towards 3GNY as the organization, and some are to Dan specifically. So I'm gonna just start first with a question for you, Dan. Are you ready?
I am.
Okay. What was your relationship like with Henry? We heard a lot about your grandmother and you. What about Henry and you?
My grandfather, Henry, or his Jewish name, Chaim, he died in 1991. So I was just 14. But I do have fond memories of him. We would hang out a lot. He would take me to, whenever we visited Milwaukee, he would take me to eat, take me to the park, and he would always affectionately call me doctor or mister, and you know, be jokey and have fun with me. And he was just such a character and such a light. We would watch sports together. We would watch like wrestling, and he just always had something funny to say. He was just such a warm personality. And even recently, I was talking to my mom about him, and she was just lamenting how, you know, it's a shame that I didn't know him as an adult, because we would have had some interesting conversations about politics and about other issues. And so, yeah, I have great memories of him, and I'm glad I got to know him, at least for the time that I did.
Well, he would be very proud of what you've built here. So this is a question for 3GNY. Have we developed a written format, a how-to manual that could be used to train 3Gs in other cities to make their presentations? So that's a great question. Gail touched on it briefly in her opening remarks that we are branching out to other states. We have 3G DC, we are helping 3G NJ, 3G Boston. We don't have a written template, but we do offer trainings, especially now during this COVID pandemic, where we are finding people that have wanted to participate but couldn't come to New York are now able to train from all over. Did Gail, you wanted to say something or no? Okay. Another question for Dan. I'm going to go back and forth. Your father's parents, you mentioned that you were the grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors. Where are your father's parents from? I don't expect you to get into their whole story. Don't worry.
And, actually, I don't know a lot about their story. They were from Riga, Latvia. And what I do know is that they, during the war, went out east to Siberia, which was not very uncommon in some of the Baltic states. I think, some of the Russian authorities would, quote unquote, volunteer Jews to be shipped to Siberia to start building out some of those towns and areas. And I believe, and they passed away. Well, I'll get to the story. Let me tell the story first and explain after. But so they spent the war years in Siberia. They came back, I believe, at the end of 1945 to Riga. And as I mentioned, throughout Europe, Jews were being attacked even after the war when they came back home, when they went to reclaim properties. And this was especially fierce in the Baltic states. So Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And when they came back, my grandfather tried to start a lumber business just outside the town. And this was not taken kindly by his neighbors, who didn't like a Jew coming back and reasserting his life there. And he was shot and killed. He was actually shot along with his cousin at the time, who survived. So this was, he was killed before my father was born. And so they emigrated to Israel, actually, after that. But yeah, it's interesting that, they didn't see, I don't believe they saw Nazi soldiers throughout the war, but he was still a victim of the anti-Semitism at the time. And
yes, absolutely.
Of the Holocaust.
Absolutely. Another question for Dan, actually. How did your grandmother retain her positive outlook after the atrocities she witnessed?
That's a tough question. And I didn't get into very deep conversations with her about those sorts of things. I mean, I did ask her about her life growing up. I asked her about her brothers and sisters who she loved so dearly. But I've talked to my mother about that. And, my grandmother I believe she had no choice. I mean, she needed to build a new life with Henry. And I don't believe that they wanted to build that life, bringing the sorrows and the pain that they had with them. And I would imagine that she did have pain. She had, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that she suffered through those memories. But, she was just protective over her children, and she wanted them to have a happy life and a happy home. And she had a great, sparkling personality. She was extremely witty. I shared some of her lines during the story. I mean, she said some of the wittiest things ever. She would crack up a table. So she just maintained her positive outlook throughout.
Absolutely. I mean, to think about her ability to speak to the Nazi and to say to him, "You're not going to mind if I have a little bread." I mean, in that moment, it just defies
the
logic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she was incredibly beautiful. I really couldn't get over all of those pictures. A question here, amazing story. How do you conduct your presentation after you have told your grandparents' story? Do you send any materials ahead before you present? So I can answer just in general, we encourage all participants have information about the class they're going into. We reach out to the teachers at the different schools before the WEDU visit. We find out, oh, they're in 8th grade, they just read night. Oh, they're in 10th grade, they just had a unit on World War II. So we try and know just how familiar they are. Because as you noticed, Dan defined in the beginning of his presentation what a bar mitzvah is. But if he were talking to a different audience, he would also define what a ghetto is. And he could even possibly have to define what a Nazi is. So we like to know in advance as much as we can, but there's a lot of thinking on your feet that happens in the classroom because we never know exactly what question a student is going to ask or what triggers them or what captivates them. So you have to really be nimble on your feet. Dan, did you want to add anything?
No, that's right. Initially, I took for granted that they would know some of the things just because they had read Night or Anne Frank, like you just said, ghetto. But it always helps to offer another, another explanation that they could hear again, because these things just aren't retained all the time. They're not immersed in Holocaust education. So that's something I've had to learn doing my presentation over again. That it's always good to pause and slow down a little bit and go over some of these concepts. That, we don't have to get caught up with every term that we know, but just the concepts are important for them to understand. Yes.
A couple of people have grandparents or parents that were also from Brest-Litovsk. One person wants to know if Menachem Begin was born there. Was he? I don't know.
Yeah, Menachem Begin was from there. And, my uncle is actually doing research right now about our history in the town and other individuals in the town. So I don't know much about the Begin connection with my family yet, but it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, the Yiddish name for the town, the Jewish name was Brisk. And, which to me is a lot smoother than saying Brest-Litovsk, but you're not going to see Brisk on many maps. But it's an interesting side note to that. There are no Jews there today, but it would be interesting to go back and look at some of those places.
Well, that was another question. Have you been back? Have you visited?
I went to Poland when I was 16 years old on it wasn't March of the Living, but it was something similarly formatted where we went to death camps and we saw the remnants of the Warsaw Ghetto. But we didn't go that far east to Brest. So I didn't get to see the city, but I'm still interested in seeing the city.
I'm sure. And I think we could end with one more question, a very powerful, thoughtful question. How do we help today's Jewish teens to see the inspiration in these stories, to stand up for themselves now, to speak up, to not be afraid? This is a very big question, and I do know that we focus mostly on reaching out to students that sometimes have never even heard of the Warsaw Ghetto or the Holocaust, but I think this is a very important question. And part of our rolling out the program, as our goal is to the 50 United States, we want to be speaking to Jewish students because too often we take it for granted that if a student is Jewish or he's getting a Jewish education, that he or she is being taught this part of the story in a way that we can teach it, we can convey it. So we hope that by emphasizing the individual and the collective and showing the power of one person to act and the power of the individual to stand up, not be a bystander, we hope that will continue to inspire Jewish people not to be afraid, because unfortunately, there's a lot to be afraid of right now.
Great. I would add to that just educating ourselves about our history is it's something that we might take for granted because if you go to Hebrew school or we're lucky enough to have a home where that's just instilled in us, but sometimes that's not always the case, and I think that's just something that we as individuals will have to take on too. I mean, if you want to be proud of your heritage, then you have to know your heritage. And I think that, sometimes it goes without saying, but sometimes it doesn't. And I think with more knowledge comes that confidence.
Right. Okay, I don't think we have much more time, but there's so many good questions. So I would say that we're eager to stay in touch with you. We're eager to answer questions over email as well. And Gail, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Gail.
Thank you, guys.
Dan, thank you so much for joining us this evening and for sharing your story. And also thank you for being the visionary behind 3GNY and for laying the foundation for me and for so many others to carry the organization forward. Leora, thanks for sharing details about WEDU with us and for all your hard work leading 3GNY's educational initiatives. If you haven't yet made a gift, we hope you'll consider making one now. Please refer to the chat box for a link to our donation page. Thank you. We hope to see you again soon. We have some interesting virtual events coming up, including WEDU Wednesdays every 2 weeks. Our next one on Wednesday, July 22nd, features Sharon Cooper, who will share her grandfather's story and how he managed to survive being a Jew in Poland, living through numerous work camps. On Wednesday, August 5th, Sherry Rude, who is active in our 3G DC group, will share her family story. Join us tomorrow evening, Thursday, July 9th, for the first of a two-part conversation on how 3Gs can be the best allies for the Black community. This event is a collaboration between 3GNY and 3GDC. The second part of this is scheduled for Thursday, July 16th. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. Have a great night.